If you spent at least 5 minutes in any mainstream A Song of Ice and Fire space, you definitely encountered theories of Mad Queen Daenerys. These are so widespread, popular and widely accepted that many people consider Dany's madness both imminent and inevitable, basically akin to being canon, and any resistance to this theory will often be met with scorn or even mockery. What does not help is that the show did utilize this narrative in the second to last episode of the show, albeit in a very messy and incoherent manner. While the show and the books had been separate canons since their very inception, Songs fans never treated it as such. To this day, the show is met with heavy reverence in spite of some performative disparaging of its later seasons. Look no further than at the fact that Show Dany burning King's Landing means to them that it will happen in the books as well, only with better setup, and it will totally make sense. But I'm here to tell you that no, it will not happen in the books. In fact, the Mad Queen Dany theory is even less feasible in the books. Before we start, remember that if you like my videos, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. Also, you can listen to this on Spotify if you prefer. Check the link in the description. Mad Queen Daenerys is a very old theory. It may even be as old as the book series itself, though I cannot give you decisive proof of that, since many forums that existed in the late 90s and early 2000s have not been archived. However, I did find some instances of early allusions to Dany's potential madness on some old message board. In September of 2002, on the Tap Talks A Song of Ice and Fire board, guest said, "And no, contrary to what some people here posted, 40-year-olds having sex on their minds 24/7 is not healthy. Personal testimonies notwithstanding, of course. Neither is a 14-year-old going on a killing spree. It is evident that her Targaryen blood's madness taint is quite strong in her. She's probably gonna be wacko even more than her daddy was, and her brother, Viserys. Well, it just so happens that Daenerys does not have sex in her mind 24/7, which you should know if you actually read the books, and hypersexuality is often a trauma response to victims of sexual violence, which Dany did endure. But in this same thread, you can also find someone calling her a whore, so these guys weren't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. Another proof I can give you is some old interactions George had with fans. In September of 2001, such interaction took place. Was it difficult to you when you wrote Dany's scene with the slavers in Storm of Swords? Was that one of the moments where the character spoke to you and changed their direction? Because for me, the act of Dany seemed out of character. I know she dislikes slavery, but she must have killed an awful lot of innocent people there. Plus, her motives to me seemed suspect. Yes, she freed the slaves, but she also got a large army for nothing. And right after she left, the slavery started up again. Dany is still very young. She has lessons to learn. That was one of them. It is not as easy to do good as it might seem, no matter how noble your intentions. Well, not much has changed, has it? As early as in 2001, Daenerys was also considered suspect for her actions to, literally free people from the horrific system of slavery. It's hard to say when exactly the theory of Dany's upcoming madness became mainstream or widely accepted, but the details of it were probably refined following the release of A Dance with Dragons, and possibly after 2012 and the famous series of essays The Meereen is Blood by Adam Feldman, where he analyzed various storylines in A Dance with Dragons, including Dany's tenure in Meereen, as well as what he believed is the conclusion to the Dornish storyline. It was then that Pasti Paji Theora raised her eyes from the cream cakes on her plate. "It is dragons." "Dragons," said her mother. "Theora, don't be mad." "I'm not. They're coming." "How could you possibly know that?" her sister asked, with a note of scorn in her voice. "One of your little dreams." Theora gave a tiny nod, chin trembling. "They were dancing, in my dream, and everywhere the dragons danced, the people died. I think this passage speaks for itself as quite obvious setup that Dany and Aegon will go to war, in a new and bloody dance of the dragons that will devastate Dorne. Again, the specifics of how we get there remain to be seen. Garbled tales blaming Dany for Quentyn's death, doubts about the Memmer's dragon's legitimacy, the Greyjoys, Aegon's arrogance, Aryan's ambitions, a scheming Tyrion, and a darker Daenerys could all play a part. But I can't really envision all of this setup paying off in any way other than a brutal war. 100 years ago, Daenerys Targaryen came to Dorne to make a peace. Now another comes to make a war. This is the tragedy of Doran Martell. He wanted his vengeance, and was obsessed with achieving it through a good war. An easy victory, a game he was guaranteed to win, using the dragons and a minimum of Dornish bloodshed. Instead, he seems headed for the opposite, a war where Dorne is pitted against the terrifying power of the dragons. It turns out when you unleash war, you unleash forces you can't control. Whether they're Darkstar, the Sand Snakes, Aryan or the dragons. Forces that can smash plans all awry. Doran thought he could master fire and blood, but instead it will turn against his country and his people. War means dead children. That's a central theme to the Dornish arc, and it's one that returns again in Aryan's first TWOW chapters. Specifically, the attention is given to Elaria's children, one of whom is sent off with Aryan. War is happening, thought Aryan, and this time Dorne will not be spared. Doom and death are coming, Elaria's son had warned them, before she took her own leave from Prince Doran. It is time for my little snakes to scatter, the better to survive the carnage. Elia-Sand, oldest of the 4 girls that Prince Oberyn had fathered on Ellaria, would cross the Sea of Dorne with Aryan. Meanwhile, another of Ellaria-Sand's children is sent to the Water Gardens. This is purely speculative, but Martin dwells on the Water Gardens so much, as such an important symbol of peace and innocent life, that I wonder if he is setting up a scene of awful bloodshed to take place there. And while Feldman did not specifically say that Dany will burn the Water Gardens, he at the very least hints at it. But the person to actually position that Dany will burn the Water Gardens was Bael Bart on Reddit in February of 2017, so a few years after Feldman's initial suggestion. But this theory had been debunked by George himself. Can you stop pretending you've already read the book? Nobody knows what the hell you're talking about with this Dany burns children at Water Garden thing. I'm a bit rusty, as it's been like 6 years since I read A Dance with Dragons, but I'm pretty sure Daenerys hasn't reached Dorne yet. And who is Dany Flint? Embarrassing. Dany Flint is a minor character who lived hundreds of years ago. The Water Gardens bit? No. I cannot be certain how popular that theory was, but it was certainly popular enough to make it to George himself, right? George rarely gives such straightforward responses to theories as well. Usually it's something like, well, maybe yes, maybe no, keep reading. But here, he seems baffled at this. If the theory was broadly correct, only the place of burning was different, the reaction would probably be more akin to that maybe yes, maybe no thing George often uses. Of course, the King's Landing theory existed in conjunction with the Water Gardens one, especially because what seems to be the actual originator of the Water Gardens theory does mention it. But it's undeniable that, following the official debunk from George, the majority of the focus went to King's Landing, rather than, questioning if Dany burning any place to the ground is a feasible theory in the first place, especially if the setup for that happening is rather flimsy and built on evidence I would describe as nebulous and maybe even circumstantial. In the original post by Bael Bart, where he mentions the possibility of Dany burning King's Landing, the reasoning broadly boils down to symbolism. If we are taking A Feast for Crows, A Song of Ice and Fire, Daenerys seems more likely candidate. The wildfire plot was initiated by her father, so it makes sense for her to fulfill it. The city consumed by flames and a dragon above it. Isn't this a perfectly ironic, given how Aerys dreamed of being reborn as a dragon? It also seems like a perfect ending to her conquest, destroying the city her ancestors built, destroying thousands of lives, paying the greatest price possible, lighting the fire for death before finding redemption in going north and fighting others to save humanity, lighting the fire for love. Narrative irony can be a very compelling tool, but it's not enough for the argument to stand by its own merits. Daenerys isn't the one paralleled to Aerys Targaryen. Cersei Lannister is, and is even compared to him by her brother Jaime, who knew the man very well. Lord Helen has assured me that the pyromancers can control the fire. The Guild of Alchemists had been brewing fresh wildfire for a fortnight. Let all of King's Landing see the flames. It will be a lesson to our enemies. Now you sound like Ares. Even in the baleful glow, Cersei had been beautiful to look upon. She'd stood with one hand on her breast, her lips parted, her green eyes shining. She's crying, Jaime had realized, but whether it was from grief or ecstasy, he could not have said. The sight had filled him with disquiet, reminding him of Aerys Targaryen, and the way a burning would arouse him. There's also the matter of Jon Connington, who is the one currently en route to King's Landing, and regrets not burning a city down. And so he swept on Stony Sept, closed off the town, and began a search. His knights went house to house, smashed in every door, peered into every cellar. He had even sent men crawling through the sewers, yet somehow Robert still eluded him. The townsfolk were hiding him. They moved him from one secret bolt hole to the next, always one step ahead of the king's men. The whole town was a nest of traitors. At the end they had the usurper hidden in a brothel. What sort of king was that? Who would hide behind the skirts of women? Yet whilst the search dragged on, Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully came down upon the town with a rebel army. Bells and battle followed, and Robert emerged from his brothel with a blade in hand, and almost slew Jon on the steps of the old sept that gave the town its name. For years afterward, Jon Connington told himself that he was not to blame, that he had done all that any man could do. His soldiers searched every hole and hovel, he offered pardons and rewards, he took hostages and hung them in crow cages, and swore they would have neither food nor drink until Robert was delivered to him. All to no avail. Tywin Lannister himself could have done no more. He had insisted one night to Blackheart during his first year of exile. "There is where you're wrong," Miles Tywin had replied. Lord Tywin would not have bothered with a search. He would have burned that town and every living creature in it. Men and boys, babes at the breast, noble knights and holy septons, pigs and horse, rats and rebels, he would have burned them all. When the fires guttered out and only ash and cinders remained, he would have sent his men in to find the bones of Robert Baratheon. Later, when Stark and Tully turned up with their host, he would have offered pardons to both of them, and they would have accepted and turned for home with their tails between their legs. He was not wrong, Jon Connington reflected, leaning on the battlements of his forebears. I wanted the glory of slaying Robert in single combat, and I did not want the name of butcher. So Robert escaped me and cut down Rhaegar on the trident. I failed the father, he said, but I will not fail the son. That seems like a far more compelling setup to me for King's Landing burning by the hands of either of those two, or both of them in conjunction, rather than narrative irony alone. And the situation in which Jon Con and Cersei are once responsible is not devoid of that irony either. While Cersei is textually parallel to Aerys, Jon Con is textually paralleled to Tywin. Griff waited that for a moment. Understand this, dwarf. You are the last and least of our company. Hold your tongue and do as you are told, or you will soon wish you had. Yes, father, Tyrion almost said. As you say, my lord. So, as you can see, many theorists enter sort of a tunnel vision with regards to Dany being the one to burn King's Landing, which would mark her as the Mad Queen. The details of this vary, but it seems like her being related to burning someplace down is the necessary prerequisite. As more counter-evidence piles, however, the goalpost is continuously shifted. Once the Water Gardens theory was no longer feasible, the shift went towards King's Landing. When you say that the last thing Dany would do is go against what she believes is her last family member, she's gonna blow up the place in grief over his untimely death. If you point out Jon Con and Cersei, Dany is still shoehorned into this narrative in one way or another, ignoring that with all the things she has to do in Essos, she will probably not be present for that deed in the first place. But if that's the case, somehow she will be blamed for it anyway, and this will be the straw that makes her into a Mad Queen, and so on and so forth. The tunnel vision with regards to Dany burning King's Landing became even narrower with the show, where Daenerys was responsible for the deed. Not only that, the show gave a lot of steam to the Mad Queen theory before that, as from very early on it was committed towards making Daenerys far more violent and ruthless than she was in the books, while downplaying her good and gentle qualities. As I was researching for this video, I stumbled onto show discussions that very early on allude to the Mad Queen theory. In May of 2012, user Sidoni on Westeros.org said, I thought it was really cool when Dany said she has dreams that come true. So it looks like she inherited the Targ family gift. She did seem a little off her rocker saying it though. I wonder if Jorah was like, here we go again, the Mad Queen. This is set in reference to the scene of Dany negotiating with the spice merchant in Season 2. Mind you, I don't think Jorah was even present in that scene. I only recall that dickhead merchant and Xaro, but I digress. In discussions for Season 3, Episode 7, in May of 2013, also on Westeros.org, user Brandslex says, "This was an important episode in the character developments of protagonist Jon Snow, loyal, lover, layered, confused boss, Jaime Lannister, growing noble by losing everything, future hand to the king. Which king? Who knows? Just a prediction. Tyrion Lannister, trapped, cornered, weak, moral. Theon Greyjoy, broken to be rebuilt, and Robb Stark, pitfall king, father, and antagonists Daenerys Targaryen, Mad Queen, Margaery Tyrell, evil, manipulative hoe, Joffrey Lannister, Pawn King, Tyrion Lannister, puppet master, hypocrite, and Ramsay Snow, super psycho, genius, boss, Jon Snow's antithetical adversary." Already positioning Daenerys as an antagonist in this story, though at that point she is negotiating with Yunkai to free their slaves. This is the episode written by George too. In June of 2013, when discussing the season finale of Season 3, users were on the fence regarding the last scene. Maria Underfoot says about her grievances, Dany being the cool savior. "Bring in the madness, people, she ain't perfect. It bothers me that so many non-readers are so in love with her." These 3 short sentences are extremely interesting to me, though I might be giving it too much importance, considering that OP probably wrote them in 2 minutes, clicked post, and promptly forgot about it. But the tone of these sentences is very interesting, and telling to me. There are broadly 2 implications here. Implication 1. The show ought to have brought the madness already. Implication 2. Non-readers of the book have a skewed view of Daenerys, and their love for her is misplaced. Meaning, they don't see something that book readers already do see. 2013 is already post A Dance with Dragons, meaning the Mad Queen Daenerys must have been cemented in the collective consciousness of the fandom. Because as you can see, Maria does not position this as a possibility or speculation, but rather the inevitable fact. Something that the showrunners should have included already in the season based on A Storm of Swords, and something that will be exacerbated in the seasons based on A Dance with Dragons. Maria continues by bringing up D&D's words about this scene and concludes. As for the D&D interview, are they forgetting that these people will be turning on her soon? Nothing wrong with this scene, it is big in the books as well, but all this talk about the free slaves being part of her identity is too much in my opinion. Which does not happen in the books at all. It does happen in the show, but this was posted before the release of Season 5, so either Maria is a prophet, or she misremembered or outright ignored that the slaves of Yunkai never turned against Dany, and also ignores that yes, freeing slaves is a big part of her identity. Misa, anyone? User Dove then continues. I think Jorah is looking nervous because Dany is walking, unharmed, into a huge crowd of people that could literally riot and rip her apart at any moment. Since in the show she didn't see the vision regarding the slaves in the House of the Undying, it's a huge deal for her to trust them and be completely, utterly vulnerable like that. I mean, feel free to quote this a few years from now if we get Mad Queen Dany and say, haha, hand gosh, you sure are a dumb idiot face. But that's what I'm going with. I have absolutely no idea how Dany being hailed as a savior by the slaves of Yunkai could lead to her being the Mad Queen several years down the line, but this proved what I asserted already, that the Mad Queen was treated as an inevitability already in 2013. By the way, this is a small digression. Look at how critical people have been of Game of Thrones as it was airing, and then remember how the show is heavily revered now and given the first seasons were good treatment. This mindset gets further cemented in discussions surrounding Season 5. In May of 2015, users Tancentrum Volgare and the Kingslayer discuss Hizdar's role. I kept meaning to bring this up. It seems that the show is casting Hizdar as a victim. Is he not going to try to poison Dany? Maybe we can't do that without strong Belvas. I'm so confused. He seems like a pointless character in this show, when he had so much purpose in the books. Why even include him if he's just some poor whipped guy for Dany to antagonize? Checklist again? Mad Queen Daenerys is giving Hizdar a few reasons for becoming a poisoner. The things she does for love of gore. In another thread, user RainisB says with regards to what I assume is the scene of Dany feeding some slave masters to her dragons. The scene worked out and it was previously built up. Besides, People got what they wanted. Daenerys is officially having Mad Queen moments now. Rhaenys B alludes to the fact that people both want and expect Daenerys to have Mad Queen moments, which they believed was previously lacking, as exemplified by Maria's comments earlier, meaning that they've seen these signs in the book as well. Needless to say, unfortunately, these people were proven right with Season 8, but the problem still remains that the show utterly failed to deliver that twist anyway. As I argued in the video dedicated to this issue, Dany intentionally burning King's Landing was not the original plan at all, which is corroborated by archived scripts accessed by the Dragon Demands, the old concept arts, and the peculiar comments made by special effects supervisors in the Blu-ray commentary, all of which confirm that the initial plan was a chain reaction of wildfire accidentally set off by Daenerys. But even if that weren't the case, the setup for her madness or extreme, senseless cruelty was never really in the narrative. In fact, I would wager that show Daenerys was not mad at all, as she hadn't displayed any signs of severe mental illness in that episode or prior to this. Famously, her father was probably schizophrenic, actually seemed to have heard voices, and had delusions of persecution, and Daenerys displayed none of that. It's not delusions of persecution if someone actually does want to poison you. What actually happened is that the showrunners simply wanted to recontextualize Dany's prior actions to justify this super shocking twist, thus creating a retcon, which created a double standard for her and her alone. And while the mentions of Dany's totally upcoming madness were present in the early 2000s as well, I feel like the show created a vicious cycle that influenced D&D's writing. I have a hypothesis that D&D were present on these fan forums and often wrote with purposes of fan service. As the show was airing, there was a running joke about Gendry rowing for several seasons, as he disappeared from the narrative for a long time, and last time he was seen escaping by boat. And this running joke was included upon his reappearance. I know this is rather flimsy evidence, but it is my belief still that the Mad Queen narrative was changed one last second, precisely for fanservice reasons. Judging by this post, D&D simply gave them what they wanted, which explains the exclusion of Jon Con from the narrative and giving aspects of his storyline to other characters. King-making plot to Varys, grayscale to Jorah, and involvement in the burning of King's Landing to Dany. Again, I will not repeat myself. If you want to get the full scope of my arguments, watch this video. As argued in another atrociously long series of videos of mine, a lot of the arguments used against book Daenerys do come from show residues. So I do believe that the show did heavily exacerbate the expectations of Dany being a Mad Queen, even if subconsciously. The show and the books had always been separate canons, as affirmed and reaffirmed by George, but one could of course say that the show should not be entirely disregarded in certain instances, as it did confirm some of the theories. For example, R plus L equals J had been confirmed by the TV show, and it can be assumed to be basically canon as of now because there is a well-known anecdote corroborated by both the producers and George that they will only be allowed to do the show if they guess who were Jon's parents. There is also the matter of the 3 confirmed holy shit moments from the show. Following the ending of the show, the broad consensus was that it's going to be Dany burning King's Landing. In 2014, George R. R. Martin met with Game of Thrones' showrunners to outline how the story they were all telling would conclude. That talk, which covered what would end up being the last 4 seasons of the show, included 3 holy shit moments: the immolation of Shireen Baratheon, the origin of Hodor's name, and one that David Benioff would only hint was from the very end. After watching Daenerys Targaryen lay waste to King's Landing, it's safe to say we've hit the third of Martin's big holy shits. It was soul-shaking to watch the dreams of a better Westeros literally go up in flames. 72 episodes worth of hope for the future, obliterated in a few fateful, terrifying minutes. To the point that this leads to fallacies on their own. Relatedly, Wise talks about the origins of Daenerys' death scene. I think the final scene between Jon and Daenerys is something we came up with somewhere in the midst of the 3rd season of the show. The broad strokes of it, anyway. But there was a tremendous amount of pressure to get it right, because we knew that this is not a scene that's giving people what they want. It's unclear whether that scene comes directly from Martin, or if Benioff and Weiss came up with it. Look at this statement again. I think the final scene between Jon and Daenerys is something we came up with sometime in the midst of the 3rd season of the show. Then, very shortly afterwards, It's unclear whether that scene comes directly from Martin or if Benioff and Weiss came up with it. Weiss literally said that the two of them came up with it 2 sentences prior, so why cast doubt on that? Because of what we keep returning to. This narrower and narrower tunnel vision that Daenerys must 100% be the Mad Queen, even if you have concrete evidence to the contrary. With the release of Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, we know all 3 holy shit moments. And guess what? None of them are about Dany's involvement in the burning of King's Landing. George R.R. Martin, author, co-executive producer. It wasn't easy for me. I didn't want to give away my books. It's not easy to talk about the end of my books. Every character has a different end. I told them who would be on the Iron Throne, and I told them some big twists like Hodor and Hold the Door, and Stannis' decision to burn his daughter. We didn't get to everybody by any means, especially the minor characters, who may have very different endings. The third holy shit moment is who becomes king in the end. Bran Stark. And even prior to this, D&D and George both were stressing the differences between the show and the books. Benioff added that fans shouldn't be concerned now that the TV show is moving further and further ahead of the books. People are talking about whether the books are going to be spoiled. And it's really not true, he said. So much of what we're doing diverges from the books at this point. And while there are certain key elements that will be the same, we're not going to talk so much about that. And I don't think George is either. Therefore, the argument that Dany will burn King's Landing and be a Mad Queen because the show is fallacious in every possible way. First of all, Mad Queen Daenerys by itself does not make sense from the narrative standpoint, as her trajectory was never written to be that of a mad and cruel tyrant, and her previous more callous and cruel moments had been retconned to make her seem worse, all while other characters were doing much similar things and were not considered mad. Again, the video, please watch it, I'm still very proud of it, it has to be one of my best. Very good for when you have some chores to do. Neither the showrunners nor George ever confirmed it. In fact, George stated that the more he writes, the more different the story is from the show. What is even more, people have no qualms about being in denial about these confirmed plot points, like the fact that yes, Stannis will burn Shireen. But Dany burning King's Landing? That just has to happen because of the show, even though nobody, not even the showrunners and not George, ever confirmed it. Whereas they did confirm Stannis burning Shireen. That happens because of that tunnel vision I keep bringing up. Very early on, the theory of Dany burning something and being the Mad Queen cemented itself in the collective consciousness of the fandom so strongly that no amount of evidence to the contrary could possibly sway its proponents. I suppose that when we get wins and Dany is nowhere near King's Landing as it burns, either people will say that George changed his mind one last second to appease toxic Dany fans, or there will be some new theory of her burning something somewhere. With my research, I came to the conclusion that, while Mad Queen Dany is a pretty old theory, it was heavily exacerbated by the show, since people lie when they say they don't like Game of Thrones' later seasons, and they were never really able to separate the two, in spite of both the showrunners and the author considering them separate entities. This also gave rise to the persistence of that tunnel vision. The theory did originate from the books, was amplified by the show, and the show amplified the books. A perpetuum mobile, a dragon eating its own tail, if you will. And when you separate yourself from these discussions and look at them without context, you should see how baffling this is. Dany is a Mad Queen because she walked without fear into the crowd of people she had just liberated from slavery. Well, it just so happens that the same baffling reasoning is present when the books are concerned, though it may be difficult to see and especially combat it if you spent many years in the fandom and are bombarded with the Mad Queen theories from every direction. But what even led people to believe that Dany's madness is so inevitable as early as in the early 2000s? This probably happens because of some rather flawed pattern recognition. The crucial reason is Dany's heritage. She is the last scion of the dynasty that comes from the scary Eastern civilization, one that has strong associations with dragons and fire, which are widely disparaged in Western cultures as ontologically evil. Also, some of her ancestors, and in particular her father, were insane or showed signs of insanity. Therefore, it seems logical that she is destined for that path as well. Why else include these elements in the story, if not as a setup for future developments? Developments that, I must say, are always suspiciously convenient for the plot. Notice how the Mad Queen Daenerys rarely if ever spends some time unleashing the tyranny of the likes of Maegor and Aerys, to whom she is habitually compared to by her antis. She is either relegated to the adversary to be easily and quickly defeated by the righteous male heroes, or a piece of meat to sacrifice in the long night, or for the creation of a magical sword. That sure is convenient if you want other characters to get her dragons, or remove her from the path to the throne. It is broadly from this assumption that all other arguments in favor of Dany's madness stem from. We've already discussed the appeal to narrative irony, which also broadly boils down to she's a Targaryen and has the misfortune of being that man's daughter and has to finish what he started, whether she wants it or not. Another one is the appeal to subversion, which is often used to prop up some theories that may otherwise be lacking. This is going to happen because it would subvert our expectations. This is going to happen because George likes to subvert tropes. This is going to happen because it lines up with how George operates as a writer, and so on and so forth. This appeal is often fallacious as well, since a whole lot of what is believed to be subversive is not subversive at all. This is precisely the case with Mad Queen Daenerys. Ironically, the mere fact that this theory is so popular is proof of how generic and non-subversive it would be as a narrative conclusion to Daenerys' arc. This isn't to say that popular theories are always incorrect and you should always be a contrarian just for the sake of being a contrarian. Rather, I mean that the specific narrative of certain people being biologically predestined towards villainy is generic and, in my humble opinion, far less narratively compelling than overcoming the sins of your father. Dany becoming a slave to her biology would, however, be underwhelming both in this story and in any other story. Rather than to put actual effort for a character to drive her own destiny, the author would instead use a cheap cop-out. She did this because she's genetically predisposed towards madness, and this is, in essence, what the proponents of this theory argue. Dany is gonna go crazy because she was born crazy, and no matter what she does, she is a slave to her biology. Nothing subversive about that. And I will even go a step further. From the canon and semi-canon we do have, we can already conclude that Dany did not inherit Aerys' madness. And it's actually very easy to do that. We must apply the scientific method. Do you know why fans have such tunnel vision with regards to the Mad Queen Dany, and why I continue to insist that their reasoning is fallacious? Because a lot of theory crafters do not apply the scientific method to their analysis. The way a lot of people create theories is that they come up with a conclusion and then scan the text for evidence. We're here to correct that. We remove the conclusion of Dany is mad or is going mad entirely and try to look at the text with as unbiased lenses as we possibly can. Nobody is 100% impartial, but applying the scientific method will allow us to at least try and remove some elements of bias from the equation. To do this, we start our reasoning not with the assumption Daenerys is mad or will be mad in the future, but rather by asking a question. Is it possible that Daenerys is mad or will be mad in the future? First things first. What is madness? Proponents of this theory have a very broad and nebulous definition of thereof, which by itself shows that the reasoning is flawed. Madness is a clinical state of mind. Cruelty, ruthlessness, or callousness are not always equivalent to madness, though they can be in some instances. But we speak of a world where cruelty, ruthlessness, and callousness of feudal lords are widespread and socially accepted. Their sense of justice and morality also considerably varies from the one we have. For Ned Stark, it is an expression of justice and law when he beheads a Night's Watch deserter. But if you, a 21st century person, decided to behead someone on the basis of them breaking a law, you would be prosecuted for murder. Westeros, or more broadly Planetos, does not really have courts, the police, jail, codified laws. The king or his representative is the final authority, and in other instances, it is up to feudal lords to execute laws, and often they are allowed to act with impunity and enact cruelty on others. For instance, Randyll Tarly punishes a thief by cutting off his fingers, orders a lashing of a baker for mixing flour with sawdust, and orders a prostitute who gave an STD to his soldiers to have her genitals washed in lye. Does it mean that he is mad? No, because violence is not always synonymous with madness. Proponents of this theory do mix these two whenever convenient, but about that once we talk about the actual foreshadowing. Since it's an article of fate for the Mad Queen Dany truthers to consider her to be the perfect carbon copy of Aerys Targaryen, we can compare and contrast them. Aerys was both mad and cruel. His reign began with promise, but there had always been some lapses, which were forgiven due to his charming nature. But there has been a series of events that exacerbated Aerys' paranoia, until eventually it grew into delusions of persecution. Some of them justified, some not. Aerys' suspicious nature became more prominent once his wife Rhaella experienced numerous stillbirths and miscarriages. But the event that decisively kick-started his insanity was the defiance in Duskendale. He was held captive for months and physically abused. Therefore, Aerys' madness wasn't entirely due to certain genetic predispositions, but also due to environmental factors. This seems to be the case in real life as well. You can have genetic predispositions towards certain mental illnesses and never develop them, because no environmental factor ever kick-started it. You can also be mentally ill and still thrive, provided you get the help you need and have a good support system. Maybe there is some timeline where Aerys never went mad. From an early age, Aerys was easily flattered. As his insanity grew, he started to surround himself solely with sycophants. Eventually, his madness manifested in cruelty against his enemies or perceived enemies. He burned people alive and delivered sexual pleasure from it, and often resorted to burnings for minor slights, such as the time where he burned his hand for resigning from his office. So, we have an established pattern of behavior, the early lapses, Rhaella's miscarriages that exacerbated his suspicious nature, the traumatic event that marked a point of no return, resulting in cruelty towards enemies and perceived enemies. Now we can compare and contrast with Daenerys Targaryen. First, let's fallaciously position our hypothesis as a fact. Daenerys Targaryen is mad like her father. Burning people alive? Happened twice. Cruelty towards enemies or perceived enemies? Happened a bunch of times. Mad Queen truthers rejoice. But because of this fallacious hypothesis, they will ignore the evidence that goes against it by removing context and the differences between the two of them. Let's instead position our thesis as a question. Is Daenerys' trajectory and behavior similar to that of Aerys Targaryen, which could in turn lead to her becoming like him? And here, the matter gets far more complicated. Like Aerys Targaryen, Daenerys lived through many traumatic events. Exile, mental and physical abuse at the hands of her brother, bridal slavery, rape, numerous assassination attempts, violation of her bodily autonomy by Mirri Maz Duur that resulted in the death of her child, deaths and betrayals of close friends and advisors. They did not lead to her becoming paranoid or developing delusions of persecution. Sure, she does wonder if she will get betrayed in the future, but considering the amount of betrayals she's faced and the threats to her life she has to deal with as a head of the abolitionist campaign, I would argue she is justified in worrying about that. But in general, Daenerys does not have a mistrustful or suspicious nature. Her philosophy is that a queen who listens to everyone is as foolish as the one who trusts everyone, finding crucial balance. Unlike Aerys, Daenerys does not surround herself with yes-men. She often encourages her counselors to speak freely to her, even if they disagree with her, and takes their advice into account when making decisions. Moreover, the voices in her councils are very varied. They include not only her supporters like Jorah, Barristan or the Freedmen, but also his Dar Zolorak and Galaza Galare, who have reasons to oppose her. Aerys cruelly punished people over slights or perceived slights, whereas Daenerys does not do that. In Meereen, the Astapori envoy Gael spits on her in front of the entire court. Her reaction? Nobody died from a bit of spit. Now, can you imagine someone spitting on Aerys Targaryen and how he would react to that? So the conclusion is, no. Daenerys does not have a trajectory similar to Aerys, nor does she engage in similar behavior. In fact, they seem to be polar opposites. But in case you remain unconvinced, there is another character heavily parallel to Aerys, one that George says is meant to be a contrast to Daenerys herself. A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons were originally meant to be one book, but were split by location. Thus, Dany is entirely absent from the book. George spoke of one peculiar problem this caused. His biggest lament in splitting A Feast for Crows from A Dance with Dragons is the parallels he was drawing between Cersei and Daenerys. The proponents of the Mad Queen Dany theory rejoice, for he said the word parallels, meaning these women are identical. Of course, they're too misogynistic to ask themselves what is the point of writing the exact same character with identical trajectory and identical conclusion, going mad and getting put down by male violence, in a series where so few women achieve positions of power. But this isn't the only time George brought up the issue of the POV split. While discussing how he writes his female characters, he also mentioned that splitting the books, as he did this time, meant we didn't get the parallel between how Daenerys and Cersei both approached the task of leadership, which is a bit of a shame. And again, the word parallel. Mad Queen thrillers rejoice, again ignoring why would Dany and Cersei have identical trajectories, and why it was so crucial to show them side by side. Could it be because they are not identical, but actually opposites? Well, it just so happens that he actually elaborated on another instance. Cersei and Daenerys are intended as parallel characters, each exploring a different approach to how a woman would rule in a male-dominated, medieval-inspired fantasy world. Again, the proponents of this theory see the word parallel and rejoice, because he confirmed that they are the same exact crazy bitch in a different font. The word different escapes them completely, but he once more expressed the regrets he had with the POV split, this time using far more decisive wording. George regrets that Cersei and Dany will not be contrasted directly. I believe that you usually contrast things that are different, right? Well, not to the fans of the Mad Queen theory apparently. They saw Cersei and Dany in the same sentence, which means that they are the exact same. And then, I shit you not, he talked about it for the 5th time. And that one of the things he regrets losing from the POV split is that he was doing point and counterpoint with the Dany and Cersei scenes, showing how each was ruling in their turn. Point and counterpoint. That surely implies that they are the same, right? 5 times, people. Not 1, not 2. 5 times he expressed regret that there won't be a direct contrast between these two. Luckily, he had no reason to express those worries. His ego-eyed fans came to the right conclusion after all, that Aerys' soul split in two and located itself in Dany and Cersei, who are identical characters, with the same trajectory and the same conclusion to their arcs. Much like parallel parking means that you can only possibly park next to the same exact car as the one you own and must later ride off to the same direction. Jokes aside, once you do actually compare and contrast Dany and Cersei's chapters, you will see these differences clear as day. This is one of the least subtle things he's ever written. For more of that, see this video. Unfortunately, this shows that ultimately, it's moot to argue with these people. You won't convince those who are already convinced, no matter how strong your arguments or how good your reasoning. But I'm a hater, so I'm not leaving it at that. Here's another way in which Dany's decisive lack of madness is present in the text already. The key of various mental illnesses involving delusions or hallucinations is that they are perceived as 100% real. Of course, with treatment and therapy, it becomes possible to combat it, but the world of A Song of Ice and Fire does not have the DSM, therapists, or medications. What is more, we talk about a world full of magic, where people regularly see visions and hear prophecies, so what constitutes a hallucination or a delusion is far more difficult to pinpoint. There are instances in the books where, from the outsider's POV, Daenerys may seem to experience hallucinations. Quaeve, am I dreaming? She pinched her ear and winced at the pain. I dreamed on you on Balerion, when we first came to Astapor. You did not dream, then or now. What are you doing here? How did you get past my guards? I came another way. Your guards never saw me. If I call out, they will kill you. They will swear to you that I am not here. Are you here? No. Hear me, Daenerys Targaryen. The glass candles are burning. Soon comes the pale mare, and after her the others, Kraken and Dark Flame, Lion and Griffin, the Sun's Son and the Mummer's Dragon. Trust none of them. Remember the Undying. Beware of perfumed seneschal. Your Grace. Missandei stood in the door of the Queen's bedchamber, a lantern in her hand. Who are you talking to? Dany glanced back towards the Parmesan tree. There was no woman there. No hooded robe, No lacquer mask, no quaive. A shadow. A memory. No one. She was the blood of the dragon, but Sir Barristan had warned her that in that blood there was a taint. Could I be going mad? They had called her father mad once. But these aren't hallucinations. Quaive really is there, using a glass candle. And guess what? Daenerys does fear that she hallucinated her, thinking of the taint of madness in her bloodline. Because overall, Daenerys is a very self-critical and self-aware person. Upon learning of the alleged taint of madness in the Targaryen bloodline, Daenerys questions whether her actions in Slaver's Bay are indicative of insanity. That morning, she summoned her captains and commanders to the garden, rather than descending to the audience chamber. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterward he gave them peace, prosperity, and justice. But all I have brought to Slaver's Bay is death and ruin. I have been more Khal than Queen, smashing and plundering, then moving on. There is nothing to stay for, said Brandon Plan. Your Grace, the slavers brought their doom on themselves, said Dariona Harris. You have brought freedom as well, Miss Andy pointed out. Freedom to starve, asked Tene sharply. Freedom to die. Am I a dragon or a harpy? Am I mad? Do I have the taint? And the Mad Queen Truders rejoice once more. She fears that she's mad? That means she is mad. This shows that, in their fallacious reasoning, they will assume that arguments against Daenerys' madness are actually arguments for. This is a conclusion you can only come to if your mind is dead set on her madness being self-evident. But the people who are insane do not question their sanity or fear potential madness. There is a character in this story who is 100% convinced that the delusions she experiences are real. He is in the walls. He killed father as he killed mother, as he killed Joff. The dwarf would come for her as well, the queen knew, just as the old woman had promised her in the dimness of that tent. Barristan Selmy concludes that he does not see the taint of madness in Dany, although she is not entirely convinced, even with his assurances. The passage where Dany asks herself, "Am I mad, do I have the taint?" happens chronologically after this conversation. I told you before that I used a false name, so the Lannisters would not know I'd joined you. That was less than half of it, Your Grace. The truth is, I wanted to watch you for a time, before pledging you my sword. To make certain that you were not my father's daughter. If she was not her father's daughter, who was she? Mad, he finished. But I see no taint in you. Taint, Dany bristled. I am no maester to quote history at you, Your Grace. Swords have been my life, not books. But every child knows that the Targaryens have always danced too close to madness. Your father was not the first. King Jaehaerys once told me that madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin. Every time a new Targaryen is born, he said, the gods toss the coin in the air, and the world holds its breath to see how it will land. So I am a coin in the hands of some god. Is that what you are saying, sir? No, Sir Barristan replied. You are the true-born heir of Westeros. To the end of my days I shall remain your faithful knight, should you find me worthy to bear a sword again. Barristan Selmy spent years in the presence of Aerys, who was unambiguously mad. Thus, he has a good point of reference to how to spot the early signs. Was my father truly mad? She blurted out. Why do I ask that? Viserys said this talk of madness was a ploy of the usurpers. Viserys was a child, and the queen sheltered him as much as she could. Your father always had a little madness in him, I now believe. Yet he was charming and generous as well, so his lapses were forgiven. His reign began with such promise, but as the years passed, the lapses grew more frequent, until... At no point does Barristan think or express that Dany had any lapses of this sort. In fact, he decisively concludes that he sees no taint in her, after he observed Dany while disguised, to see and judge her for himself. Not only does Barristan conclude that Dany is decisively not mad, he also grows to see her as not a monarch he follows out of duty, but as someone he follows out of choice. But I see counter-arguments already. Barristan is simply a fool, he misjudged Dany, everyone around Dany and including Dany herself are unreliable narrators who hallucinate everything that happens around them, that sort of thing. As with the burning of King's Landing, the goalpost is continuously moved. And how about Quentyn Martell? As Quentyn makes his way to Meereen, he hears horrific stories about Daenerys. Wed her or fight her. Either way, I will face her soon. The more Quentyn heard of Daenerys Targaryen, the more he feared that meeting. The Yunkai claimed that she fed her dragons on human flesh and bathed in the blood of virgins to keep her skin smooth and supple. Beans laughed at that, but relished details of the Silver Queen's promiscuity. One of her captains comes of a line where the men have foot-long members, he told them. But even he's not big enough for her. She rode with the Dothraki and grew accustomed to being fucked by stallions, so now no man can feel her. And Books, the clever Volantine swordsman who always seemed to have his nose poked in some crumbly scroll, thought the Dragon Queen both murderous and mad. Her Khal killed her brother to make her queen. Then she killed her Khal to make herself Khaleesi. She practices blood sacrifice, lies as easily as she breathes, turns against her own on a whim. She's broken truces, tortured envoys. Her father was mad too. It runs in the blood. It runs in the blood. King Aerys II had been mad. All of Westeros knew that. He had exiled 2 of his hands and burned a 3rd. If Daenerys is as murderous as her father, must I still marry her? Prince Doran had never spoken of that possibility. But as Quentyn does make it to Meereen and meets Daenerys, his opinion on her changes drastically. She laughed at him, said Pretty Marys. Daenerys never laughed. The rest of Meereen might see him as an amusing curiosity, like the exiled Summer Islander King Robert used to keep at King's Landing, but the Queen had always spoken to him gently. Sure enough, we will also hear about unreliable, hallucinating narrators in this case, which is why so many people can't wait for Tyrion to interact with Dany, sure that he will confirm her imminent madness. And if that doesn't happen, well, let us not forget the unreliable narrators. The script continues. Tunnel vision, moving the goalpost. I will gladly touch upon the irony here. The way the slavers of Essos speak of Daenerys is not at all different from the way her most vitriolic fandom critics speak of her. She too gets accused of killing Viserys, engaging in senseless torture, and killing people on a whim. More about that later. So, let us return to our hypothesis. Is Daenerys' trajectory and behavior similar to that of Aerys Targaryen, which could in turn lead to her becoming like him? The answer is a decisive no. And that should bury this hypothesis for good, for as in principle, even one argument that undermines the hypothesis is enough for it to be debunked. But I'm not leaving it at that, as I like to be thorough. We've already established that it's not subversive or narratively compelling for Dany to be a slave to her biology, but Mad Queen Dany is additionally amplified by some other cultural and societal aspects that should not be disregarded, and which are equally non-subversive. Namely, Daenerys is a revolutionary abolitionist, and it's actually very common for stories featuring such figures to make them just as bad, if not worse, than those they fight against. This is done for propaganda purposes to send the message to the masses that the status quo should be preserved. Nothing subversive about putting the evil bitch down and preserving the status quo. Additionally, we should not disregard how misogyny amplifies all of it, because female madness is another persistent theme in our culture and society, going back to ancient Greeks and their invention of the female hysteria, and women being institutionalized and lobotomized for perceived madness further down the line. Nothing subversive about misogyny. Essentially, the base on which this theory rests is that the Mad Queen Truders see familiar patterns they've seen play in other stories and broader culture, and instinctively apply them to Daenerys, which is what I meant when I said that the popularity of this theory proves how generic and predictable it is. And they do so not with one generic and predictable pattern, but 3 separate ones. The last 2 of my sentiments are actually echoed by the Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who excellently argues in his review for Season 8. The finale combines the rejection of a radical change with an old anti-feminist motive at work in Wagner. For Wagner, there is nothing more disgusting than a woman who intervenes in political life, driven by the desire for power. In contrast to male ambition, a woman wants power in order to promote her own narrow family interests, or, even worse, her personal caprice, incapable as she is of perceiving the universal dimension of state politics. The same femininity which, within the close circle of family life, is the power of protective love, turns into obscene frenzy when displayed at the level of public and state affairs. Recall the lowest point in the dialogue of Game of Thrones, when Daenerys tells Jon that if he cannot love her as a queen, then fear should reign. The embarrassing Valier motive of a sexually unsatisfied woman who explodes into destructive fury. Daenerys as the Mad Queen is strictly a male fantasy, so the critics were right when they pointed out that her descent into madness was psychologically not justified. The view of Daenerys with mad furious expression, flying on a dragon, and burning houses and people, expresses patriarchal ideology with its fear of a strong political woman. So justice prevailed. But what kind of justice? The new king is Bran, crippled, all-knowing, who wants nothing, with the evocation of the insipid wisdom that the best rulers are those who do not want power, a dismissive laughter that ensues when one of the new elite proposes a more democratic selection of the king, tells it all. And one cannot help but note that those faithful to Daenerys, to the very end, are more diverse. Her military commander is black, while the new rulers are clearly white Nordic. The radical queen who wanted more freedom for everyone, irrespective of their social standing and race, is eliminated. Things are brought back to normal. I have already discussed in the past how Mad Queen Daenerys is a patriarchal, male psychosexual Freudian fantasy, down to the phallic imaginary of Jon stabbing her. It's a result of the centuries-long pathologization of women's emotions, combined with the disdain towards women exercising political power. In this context, Dany's Targaryen heritage and her being Aerys' daughter, and she never even knew him, is just a convenient building block to argue in favor of her madness, and subsequent putting her in her place as a woman. Most of this is probably not done out of genuine malice, though it by no means diminishes its impact. But misogyny is such a pervasive and normalized form of oppression that it escapes people entirely, even those who claim themselves to be feminist or progressive. Rather than to see the inherent misogyny to this theory, it feels right to them, because such perception of women in power has been ingrained in our minds since we were children. In simpler terms, Mad Queen Daenerys is no different from male chauvinists, saying that women cannot be in positions of power because they get crazy on their period. One could of course argue that George is no better in this regard, as he too wrote some women in power in a questionable way, most notably Cersei and Rhaenyra. True, he isn't free of that bias either, and the way he constructed these two should be criticized. And this is why I want him to correct that mistake with Daenerys. Whereas Mad Queen Thruders want to see another woman in power become incompetent, crazy and stupid, and then get murdered by a male relative. I doubt any Mad Queen Thruder made it this far into the video. They probably already disliked it, left a comment saying "you're a delusional Dany stan" and turned it off. But in case someone is still watching, ask yourself, why do you so badly want to see it happen? And for the third time, no less. As established, the theory of Mad Queen Dany formed due to falling into non-subversive and predictable tropes and beliefs about biological determinism, female hysteria, negative sentiments towards strong political women, and disdain towards revolutionary change. That forms what I would call the base. Dany's actual actions in the text serve as additional fuel to the base, and those are most often referred to as moments of madness foreshadowing. As they serve to prop up the base, let's call it Mad Queen Dany theory superstructure. TV Tropes defines foreshadowing as a clue or allusion embedded in the narrative that predicts some later event or revelation. It could be a wayward comment or action, an event that doesn't make sense until later, a meaningful name, a rare blood type. So many things can warn us of the future. The foreshadowing might be ominous, or mildly suggestive, or it could merely be obvious in hindsight. Foreshadowing is something George R.R. Martin utilizes frequently and quite skillfully in his books, which debunks the popular myth that his modus operandi is just pulling plot twists out of nowhere. That's D&D, the creators of Game of Thrones. To name an example, the Red Wedding was foreshadowed already in A Clash of Kings, a book before it happens. Further on, she came upon a feast of corpses. Savagely slaughtered, the feasters lay strewn across overturned chairs and hacked trestle tables, as prowling pools of congealing blood. Some had lost limbs, even heads. Severed hands clutched bloody cups, wooden spoons, roast fowl, heels of bread. In a throne above them sat a dead man with the head of a wolf. He wore an iron crown and held a length of lamp in one hand, as a king might hold his scepter, and his eyes followed Dany with mute appeal. Funnily enough, as I explored some very old A Song of Ice and Fire forums pre the release of A Storm of Swords, The vision was disregarded by some people. Alexandria on Fortune City says, Rob is one of my favorite characters, but a lot of people think he will die. I think Dany's vision and Theon's dream could be prophetic, but maybe George R.R. Martin is leading us a different way. Usually he doesn't seem to spell things out like that. Redhorn responds, I agree with you, Alexandria. I feel that if Rob doesn't die, which I don't think will happen, he will become a more detailed character in the second trilogy of the series. And about Dany's vision, I agree with you as well. I don't think that Martin would reveal his plans so easily. Even though the evidence points in the other direction, but since when could you rely on the evidence? It's the Seven Kingdoms, not goddamn America. I'm not showing this to mock anyone. I just think it's funny how fandom low-key never learned from this and still insists that some well-set-up things will not happen because it's too obvious. Good writing is not when you're just shocked to see a plot twist. It's when a certain occurrence happens, and amidst your shock, you ask yourself, how the hell did I not see that coming? I also include this exchange to encourage you guys to be healthily critical of theories you see that use this reasoning, too obvious, subversion, etc. As we've already established, some of those are not really subversive at all, and the appeals to subversions are often there to hide flawed reasoning or lack of convincing arguments. Now, I already hear the screams of those 3 Mad Queen throoters who are still boosting my algorithm with watch time. You are just like these early Red Wedding Danielists. You see all these signs and ignore them because you think it will be too obvious for Dany to go mad. And all this because you're a biased Dany extremist. Well, the crucial difference is that, as established, Dany going mad would actually be the obvious playing the trope straight in a way that is non-subversive and misogynistic. I can't stress this enough. Misogyny is the oldest form of oppression. No misogynistic trope can ever be subversive if played straight. And a powerful female leader going mad is just female hysteria with extra steps. Take it up with my good friend Slavoj, who I'm sure is a biased Dany extremist as well.
When you're in town here, do you ever get approached by local fans or something like that?
What do you mean by fans? People hate me.
But the Red Wedding was actually subversive because Rob living to be this great leader and avenging his father would be something straight out of a fairy tale. The Red Wedding became one of the most iconic cultural moments in history precisely because it squashed our expectations that he would emerge victorious and rule wisely. All that irrespective of the fact that the foreshadowing for it happening was so in your face. The undying vision is not even metaphorical. It really was a feast of corpses and Rob really had Grey Wind's head sewn into his body. Dreams and prophecies are a very good way to introduce foreshadowing in a fantasy setting. And it just so happens that Dany has a series of tens of prophecies and visions in the Undying chapter. If her destiny is to nuke King's Landing and be a Mad Queen, then we could see if any visions point to this direction. The Undying chapter is a beloved of Dany Anti's, as due to their flawed assumptions, they believe that any and all visions she receives there are negative and point to her imminent doom. I mean, she sees Ares. That alone to them means that she is destined to walk into his steps, ignoring that Drogon reacts to him with anger, and Dany immediately leaves the scene, whereas she stays for a long time to the vision of Rhaegar and Alia, where he passes the prophecy of the Song of Ice and Fire to her as his heir and spiritual successor. Like with everything else, these arguments against her madness and walking into Aerys' footsteps are twisted to actually be arguments for, due to the flawed reasoning at the base of the theory. Still, the proponents of this theory will insist that the foreshadowing of Dany going mad is as abundant as that for the Red Wedding. The matter of what constitutes foreshadowing in this particular instance cannot be decisively concluded. The event hadn't yet happened, if it happens at all, which means that we cannot return to the previous books and see whether the clues have been there all along, the way we could do with the Red Wedding. And as demonstrated, just about anything can be used as foreshadowing if you squint hard enough. In general, however, for George, foreshadowing seems to work in rather symbolic ways than outright spelling it out. Another instance of foreshadowing is the Starks encountering a direwolf killed by a stag at the beginning of a Game of Thrones. Also very straightforward imaginary, with the invocations to the heraldry of Starks and Baratheons, to the point that even Caitlyn sees it as an ill omen. As established, just about anything can be twisted as Mad Queen Dany foreshadowing, but fact for the matter is, we actually lacked dreams or prophecies that would decisively point in that direction. Of course, that is more of a semantic issue, as such a deed has to be foreshadowed and set up in more ways than just dreams. So let's assume that concrete actions can also constitute that foreshadowing. So, how do we differentiate if it's foreshadowing or not if we don't yet have the conclusion? Again, by using the scientific method. The reason why I dedicated such a long time to explain why this theory is so popular is because the way it was approached is fallacious in the base. The same flawed reasoning is seen in the analysis of the superstructure of this theory, as Mad Queen Dany Thruder's obsessively scan the text in search of actions Dany took that proves her madness imminent, making the exact same mistake as with the base, positioning their hypothesis as a fact and not a question. This leads them to ignore crucial evidence against, including things like context and in-universe rules. Much like the case of Cersei and Dany POV split, the evidence against will outright be ignored or twisted as evidence for. Moreover, their tunnel vision will cause them to judge Daenerys by a completely different set of morals than they would do other characters. They say, Dany is displaying signs of madness and cruelty that prove she is like Aerys. I will instead form the hypothesis as, is Daenerys displaying signs of madness and cruelty that prove she is like Aerys? To test this, we will choose two favorite moments of Mad Queen Dany Thruder's, the crucifixion of the slave masters of Meereen and the Mirri Maz Duur fiasco. When you read, Dany crucified 163 people of the city she conquered without context, that should strike you as an example of needless cruelty against the subjugated population. But this act receives a completely different dimension once you learn why it happened. The city was conquered not out of imperialist interest, but to free its slaves and feed the freedmen. And before that, the great masters of Meereen had withdrawn before Dany's advance, harvesting all they could and burning what they could not harvest. Scorched fields and poison wells had greeted her at every hand. Worst of all, they had nailed a slave child up on every milepost along the coast road from Yunkai, nailed them up still living, with their entrails hanging out, and one arm always outstretched to point the way to Meereen. Leading her van, Daario had given orders for the children to be taken down before Dany had to see them, but she had counter-commanded him as soon as she was told. I will see them, she said. I will see everyone and count them and look upon their faces, and I will remember. By the time they came to Meereen sitting on the south coast beside her river, the count stood at 163. I will have this city, Dany pledged to herself once more. In the plaza before the Great Pyramid, the Meereenese huddled forlorn. The great masters had looked anything but great in the morning light. Stripped of their jewels and their fringed tokars, they were contemptible, a herd of old men with shivered bows and spotted skin, and young men with ridiculous hair. Their women were either soft and fleshy, or as dry as old sticks, their face paint streaked by tears. I want your leaders, Dany told them. Give them up, and the rest of you shall be spared. How many? One old woman had asked, sobbing. How many must you have to spare us? 163, she answered. She had them nailed to wooden posts around the plaza, each man pointing at the next. The anger was fierce and hot inside her when she gave the command. It made her feel like an avenging dragon. But later, when she passed the men dying on the posts, when she heard their moans and smelled their bowels and blood, was it a cruel act? Absolutely. But it did not happen because Dany wanted to sate some lust for cruelty, or because it was a personal slight the way Aerys Targaryen would. This was, first and foremost, retaliation for the atrocity they did first. This isn't like Aerys burning people alive because they wanted to resign from office. This is a state carrying out the atrocity against defenseless children solely to taunt Daenerys as the figure of the abolitionist campaign. In response, Daenerys punishes the representatives of the state that carried out this atrocity, and there's very clear hints of regret here. I'm sure Aerys regretted burning people alive all the time, right? I'm sure he was burning them in response to horrific crimes against children and not for slights against himself, right? By the way, she shouldn't have those regrets, and should have actually killed them. However, if you have a preconceived belief you hold very strongly, context will not matter to you. Even though the crucifixion of the slave children is one of the cruelest acts done in a story known for gratuitous violence. This is why people in earnest argue that she crucified innocent slave masters. For this madness foreshadowing moment to hold up, you need to position them as victims of the Mad Queen, not unlike the people Ares burned. Some people are more aware of the optics of talking about innocent slave masters, so they rush for other ways to condemn this act. The claims I've seen most commonly is that she didn't do enough to investigate the crime. This shows yet another pattern that we've seen already with Baristan and Quentin and the appeals to unreliable narrators. Moving the goalpost. Once you point out the evidence they miss that goes against their hypothesis, try to add context or question why they degrade people who own human beings like chattel, they twist the argument to confuse you. Well, obviously, there are no innocent slave masters, but Dany hadn't done enough to investigate this crime. Due to this rash decision, there is a possibility that the Masters of Myrrine gave their least powerful to protect themselves as a group. And because there was no genuine investigation, it's possible that some slave masters who are in favor of enacting that atrocity got away with it. We spoke earlier about how people in Westeros have different morality than we do. Ned beheading a Night's Watch deserter would have been prosecuted for murder if he did this in our world. Randall Tarley would have been prosecuted for severe bodily harm if he cut off a man's fingers for stealing. All leaders in this story would have been prosecuted for war crimes, even the most just and noble ones. But they're not, because in that world you don't have courts and codified criminal laws, and you don't have Geneva Conventions either. These guys operate on a different set of principles that stem from the fact that they're all feudal lords or monarchs. And this is self-evident to everyone until it's Daenerys Targaryen, who is expected to abide by 21st century morality, else she is a mad queen. Investigating this crime would take months, if not years. There are no codified laws Dany could use as precedent for the punishment. Should she establish those? I mean, it would be cool if Dany was the one to establish the basis for the in-universe international law. She could call it Myrrine Conventions. But why is that expectation on her in the first place? No other character in this story is held to that standard. It is self-evident to everyone that other monarchs or lords will operate within the morality of their world. Dany really is no different from Stannis executing Axel Florent for trying to make peace with the Lannisters, considered treason. In fact, I would even wager that her actions are far more justified, as they were punishment not for something as nebulous as treason, but for something that would probably be prosecuted for war crimes in our world as well. And if Stannis went on a campaign to Essos to end slavery and crucified these people, I'm sure it would be hailed as a great act of justice, proving how noble he is, rather than madness foreshadowing. Planetos is not a place where kings or queens get the he ruled wisely treatment, and in the world of Planetos, people in the position of leadership need to get their hands dirty. So if any other character getting their hands dirty by executing people without establishing the ICC before is not a sign of madness, why would it be in the case of Daenerys? Because the goalpost is continuously shifted to hold together this preconceived belief of Dany's madness. Dany will inevitably be judged by a different set of standards, because otherwise her behavior will be not at all unique among other leaders in the series. If she is mad for enacting a cruel punishment, then so is everyone else. But because only she is believed to be mad for doing that, only she has to be judged by 21st century morality. Only of her there is an expectation to act like a 21st century leader, investigating a war crime. And only she should send them to The Hague instead of enacting the punishment herself. That The Hague does not exist there notwithstanding. The circle closes. Of course, this isn't to say that the morality of Planetos is something that should never be criticized, and is often scrutinized in the text itself. But in that case, either we criticize all of them or none of them. You don't get to pick and choose who is allowed to act within the rules of their world, and who has to develop our sensibilities. This is also a good moment to bring up that Mad Queen truthers have a very broad definition of madness. To them, madness and cruelty are synonymous whenever convenient. Hence, every time Dany uses violence in any context for any reason is proof of their theory. That is because her madness is so self-evident to them that obviously everything she does are actions of an insane person, no matter if it is no different from the actions of other leaders in the story and no matter the context. Unlike Aerys, Daenerys does not enact this punishment due to delusions of persecution or because it was a personal slight. And unlike Aerys, she comes to have regrets over acting the way she did. But as already established, cruelty and madness are not always synonymous anyway. This is where they will usually bring up Maegor to additionally spice their argument up, as his cruelty was likely the result of a clinical state of sociopathy or psychopathy. But then, you need to make up your mind. Either Daenerys is a Mad Queen because she inherited Aerys' psychosis, or she is a sociopath-psychopath. And if Daenerys is a sociopath or psychopath for cruelly punishing her enemies, then so should be Stannis for burning Florent. But no, that's different. Again, because the confirmation bias is too strong to see this fallacious reasoning. The moving of the goalpost is visible in other condemnations of Daenerys' more morally ambiguous actions. Most notably the situation with Mirri Maz Duur. Here's what unambiguously happens. Daenerys is sold into bridal slavery and remains Drogo's property all throughout the Game of Thrones. What little power she has, she derives from Drogo, and that she wrestles by being repeatedly sexually assaulted by him at the age of 13, 14. That little power she has, she uses to try her best to protect women in the raided village. In response, one of the survivors, Mirri Maz Duur, tricks Daenerys into trusting her, kills her husband as revenge, meaning that Dany herself and the women she claimed no longer have this little protection they had prior, and Dany is almost killed by his blood riders. Mirri then violates her bodily autonomy by causing her a painful miscarriage, all because her son committed the sin of being Drogo's child and over a prophecy. Usually the fandom loves to say that prophecies are false or unreliable, until it's that specific one, in which case Mirri is justified for murdering a fetus. In response, Dany executes her in part for what she did and in part as a blood sacrifice ritual that births dragons. This is probably Dany's most morally ambiguous action to date. But it's still not at all different to how parents in Planetos react to the murders of their children. Aegon II Targaryen, whom many Danyantys love to death, tortured the murderers of his son to death and then ordered to hang all the rat catchers in King's Landing, as one of them had that profession. That strikes me as far more extreme, yet rarely will you see Aegon in the pantheon of mad Targaryens. If it's not madness for him to enact such acts on blood and cheese and murdering all the rat catchers in the city, why is it a sign of madness for Daenerys to execute a woman who murdered her child in the womb? We know why. Have an assumption in mind, scan the text for cruel or morally ambiguous actions without taking the context and the in-universe standard of behavior into account, Mad Queen confirmed. But to make this act worse than it actually is, the situation is additionally twisted, much like the case of the crucified slave masters. Actually, Mirri was justified in murdering a child in his 14-year-old mother's womb and was actually based for it, as Dany is her slave owner. Do you insinuate that slaves have no right to rebel against their masters? And please forget that golden collar she wore when she met with Drogo. She was actually a powerful Khaleesi. Please don't remember how the Dothraki treat women and how little it means to be a Khaleesi. Please don't do that. But actually, we have no proof that Mirri did it on purpose. Forget that she explicitly admits to doing it and gives her reasoning in the text proper. What actually happened is that Dany not only killed a slave for rebelling against her master, she actually killed an innocent slave, as Mirri wasn't actually responsible for the deaths of either Rhaego or Drogo. If you show them the appendix where it says Rhaego slain in the womb by Mirri Maz Duur, they're gonna say, actually, the appendix is an unreliable narrator, and we can't be sure if this is what happened. Yes, they really say that. Once you look at it impartially and try to scrutinize the reasoning, you will realize how silly it is, to the point that it's often unintentionally hilarious, and the arguments become ridiculous. All of this is because of circular reasoning, cherry-picking, and confirmation bias stemming from deciding what the text says before you even look at it. The last thing I will do is test whether my hypothesis is correct. By hypothesis, I mean if fans of the series really do engage in fallacious reasoning. To do this, I will pick one character and apply to them the same hypothesis Mad Queen Intruders do to Daenerys. Jon Snow is mad and destined to become like the Mad King. Considering that R+L=J is basically canon, that means Jon Snow is a son of a Targaryen and a grandson to another Targaryen. Aerys was obviously mad, and Rhaegar? Well, he kidnapped a teenager to forcibly impregnate her due to his obsession with prophecy. As we know, prophecies are all fake, so his prophecy obsession was actually an expression of psychotic delusions. So, both his father and grandfather were insane. It's therefore inevitable that Jon inherited the Targaryen madness taint. And the text agrees with me. Jon is shown as an arrogant boy from the very beginning, thinking of Myrcella as stupid for no reason other than his misogyny. Later, he starts bullying other recruits in the Night's Watch and is in denial about his callousness towards them, as he refuses to listen to Don Alnoy patiently explaining to him that he's a privileged bully. Later, he threatens one of the recruits with his wolf so that he does his bidding and attacks an innocent man with a knife over a mere slight. Wow, Aerys vibes match. He kills Corin Halfhand, betrays the Night's Watch, and repeatedly breaks his vows with Ygritte. Things aren't looking good for him. He murders innocent free folk who just want to escape the existential horror he is well aware of. As he sees them burn alive, he thinks. The sound below changed to shouts and screams. Sweet music to their ears. Sweet music of the sounds of people being killed by fire now, if that doesn't sound like Aerys. Once Stannis offers him Winterfell, Jon thinks about how he had always wanted it, and it has been a hunger in him he couldn't quench. If this isn't Mad King Jon foreshadowing. Following a vote for Lord Commander he knows is manipulated and does nothing to resist it, Jon kidnaps a baby from its mother's arms and threatens her into cooperation by holding her hand above the fire. What's with the obsession with fire this guy has? Reminds me of someone else. He also dreams of beheading Robb and stealing his inheritance. If this isn't madness foreshadowing, and then he beheads a man for merely refusing to follow an order, Grandpa would be proud. I did the exact same thing as Mad Queen Dany Intruders do, by interpreting the text as uncharitably as possible for Jon. I ignored crucial context, for example, how he threatened Rast to protect Sam, and how Corin ordered Jon to kill him and infiltrate the Wildlings. I relied on biological determinism and nebulous definitions of madness to prop myself up. I used Jon's thoughts that he never acted upon to condemn him, and so on and so forth. I bet this sounded ridiculous to you, right? But it just so happens that all the arguments in favor of Dany's madness and villainy are the exact same bullshit. Only one is widely accepted, and you will never see the other, because nobody ever approaches Jon with those preconceived conclusions. But I gotta say, that quote of the screams of burned people being like music to him is really, really horrible even in context. Imagine if Dany thought that. So much scrutiny is placed on Daenerys in particular precisely because the goal was never to prove a hypothesis, as there was no hypothesis at all. There was an assumption. They formed a conclusion already and simply look for what furthers their narrative, even if it's disproved by the text itself, or even if it requires mental gymnastics of unreal proportions. You should not be coming to these conclusions if you read the text while reducing your bias to a minimum. I could give you examples upon examples upon examples of that Mad Queen foreshadowing, but it would make this video even longer than it is now, and I would probably miss some, because essentially any and all actions Dany takes could be considered madness foreshadowing if you squint hard enough. I once compiled the most ridiculous ones I found, and some of them included eating figs, because figs have bad symbolism, being born during this storm, because storms are bad, being named Daenerys because it's similar to Matt Daniel Lodstone, who was some minor character from 100 years back. It's very difficult to work against the Mad Queen Thunders, however silly and ridiculous their arguments are. The omnipresence of this theory and any annual backlash to questioning it will easily intimidate you. And ultimately, there is no point in resisting it. You could have George stand up and say, "I read your Mad Queen theories and they're all bullshit, please stop," and they would still insist on it. When we get wins and Dany does not go mad, then her madness will become imminent in Dream. And if we get Dream and nothing of the sort happens, they will say that he changed his mind to appease toxic Dany fans. Instead of me spending hours debunking all Mad Queen foreshadowing moments, treat what I have just gone over as a set of tools that will make it easier for you to scrutinize this narrative by yourself. And hopefully see that there is no substance behind it, and it's not nearly as damning and well thought as it's made to seem. If George really is going to give us Mad Queen Dany, then he did a terrible job with a setup and relied on some very flimsy and predictable tropes to deliver it. I expect better of him. And you should too. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my videos, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes, and ashes always land on top.